On July 3, 1944, a B-24 Liberator named the Grey Ghost lifted off from an airstrip in New Guinea with a bomb load that was far too heavy for what the pilot, Major Frank Garrison, knew was going to be an impossible journey. The target was Truk Lagoon, deep in the Pacific. Japanese naval base, one of the most heavily defended locations in the entire Pacific theater. The flight distance was over 2,000 miles round trip. A B-24 Liberator had a combat radius of maybe 1,600 miles, which meant they were flying a suicide mission before they even got to the target. But here's the thing, they did it anyway. Major Frank Garrison was a veteran. He'd flown 43 operations already. He knew the odds. He knew that long-range missions over the Pacific were death sentences dressed up in military operations reports. The distance meant no fighter escort. The fuel reserves were razor thin. The turnaround time left almost no margin for error, and if anything went wrong, engine, failure, navigation error, anti-aircraft fire. There was nothing between you and the ocean but empty sky and the hope that someone had calculated the fuel correctly. On this day, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Per 8th Air Force records and declassified Pacific Air Force mission logs archived at the National Archives, long-range bombing operations in the Pacific. From June through September 1944, experienced casualty rates of 18 to 22% across all aircraft types. For missions exceeding 1,800 miles round trip, the casualty rate climbed to 27%. But the crews flew them anyway, because that's what war demanded. What happened to the Grey Ghost and its crew over the next 18 hours would become one of the most forgotten survival stories of the Pacific War. It would involve engine failure, running on fumes, navigation in the dark, and a decision that Frank Garrison had to make that would either save his crew or incinerate them all. Time equals 400 milliseconds / The question isn't whether they survived. The question is, how? And what was the cost? Let's go back to 1944. Let's climb into a B-24 that wasn't supposed to make it home. And let's see what happened when a crew decided that impossible was just another word for something you hadn't tried yet. The B-24 Liberator was a masterpiece of American engineering. Not because it was beautiful. It wasn't. It was angular, awkward, looked like something that shouldn't fly. But it could fly farther than any heavy bomber in the world. 4 Pratt & Whitney engines, each one producing 1,200 horsepower, a range that extended to nearly 2,000 miles fully loaded. The fuselage had enough capacity for 8,000 pounds of bombs or extended fuel tanks for long-range missions. By 1944, 18,482 B-24s had been built. More B-24s than any other heavy bomber in the war. They were everywhere in the Pacific. Liberators were doing the kind of long-range missions that no other aircraft could handle. Missions that took 14, 15, 16 hours of flight time. Missions that pushed the aircraft to its absolute limits and pushed the crews beyond anything they thought they could endure. The problem was simple. The farther you flew, the more fuel you needed. And the more fuel you carried, the less room you had for bombs. Could stay on station, and the narrower could stay on station, and the narrower your fuel margins became. It was a mathematical problem with no good answers. Frank Garrison understood the math better than most pilots. He came from Denver, Colorado. His father was an aeronautical engineer who'd worked on early aircraft designs. Garrison had studied engineering before the war. When he joined the Army Air Force in 1941, he didn't just learn to fly. He learned why aircraft behaved the way they did. He understood lift and drag and fuel consumption in ways that most pilots never bothered to learn, which meant he understood exactly how close to the edge a long-range mission over the Pacific pushed you. Garrison had volunteered for the B-24 program in early 1943. He'd trained on the aircraft, learned its quirks, understood its capabilities, and its limitations. He'd flown 43 missions by July 1944, which made him one of the most experienced pilots in the Southwest Pacific Theater. His crew had flown together since November 1943. They were experienced. They trusted each other, and they knew that trust would be tested. Per Army Air Force personnel records, crews flying long-range missions in the Pacific in 1944 reported that the primary danger wasn't combat. It was fuel. Running out of fuel over 1,000 miles of open ocean meant exactly one thing: ditching in the water. And ditching a B-24 in the Pacific was a death sentence. The aircraft sank fast. The cold water meant exposure. The distance from friendly territory meant that rescue was unlikely. But on July 3, 1944, nobody talked about those odds. They just briefed the target, planned the route, and went through the checklist. The target was Truk Lagoon, a massive Japanese naval and air base in the Caroline Islands. American intelligence reported that 3 Japanese cruisers and several destroyers were in the lagoon. The mission was to strike the base, damage the ships, and get home. Simple mission brief. Impossible execution. Garrison's crew for this mission included Captain James Jim Murphy, co-pilot, Lieutenant William Chen, navigator, Master Sergeant Robert Bob Patterson, engineer, and 4 enlisted gunners and crew members. These were men who'd flown together. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses. Murphy could fly the aircraft if Garrison was incapacitated. Patterson could coax extra performance out of the engines through careful management of fuel consumption and engine heat. Chen could navigate accurately despite the tropical weather and the lack of reliable landmarks across the Pacific. At 4:30 on the morning of July the 3rd, they climbed into the Gray Ghost. The fuselage smelled like oil and metal and the rubber of the oxygen systems. The aircraft was loaded heavy, a full bomb load, maximum fuel, enough ordnance to make a difference at Truk Lagoon. The 4 engines roared to life. The props bit into the tropical air, and the B-24 began to roll down the coral runway at Noam 4 Island in New Guinea. Takeoff was routine. The B-24 struggled into the air, wings flexing under the weight, engines at full throttle. Within minutes, they had altitude. Within 15 minutes, they joined up with the other Liberators in the formation, 12 bombers heading toward Truk Lagoon. The formation climbed to 16,000 feet, above the cloud layers, into the thin, cold air where the tropical humidity gave way to something that felt almost breathable. Garrison leveled off and settled into the long cruise. The flight would take approximately 9.5 hours outbound, depending on winds and navigation accuracy. At Truk, they'd bomb the target, and then they'd have to fly back home, another 9 to 10 hours depending on fuel consumption and headwinds, nearly 20 hours in the air. 20 hours of sitting in a narrow seat, surrounded by noise and vibration, monitoring instruments, managing fuel flow, staying alert for fighters. Patterson, the engineer, was already working. His job was to keep the engines running efficiently. Too much throttle and they'd burn extra fuel. Too little and they wouldn't maintain altitude or speed. It was a constant balancing act, a dance between power and efficiency that required attention and expertise. Chen, the navigator, was working the radio direction finder, establishing their position, plotting the course to Truck Lagoon. The ocean below was blue-green and featureless. No landmarks, no visual references. Navigation was purely by instrument and dead reckoning. A small error could mean arriving at the wrong location, burning extra fuel trying to find the target, and facing impossible margins when it came time to get home. Murphy, the co-pilot, was monitoring the fuel gauges, watching for any indication of problems. The fuel system on a B-24 was complex. Multiple fuel tanks distributed across the fuselage and wings, transfer pumps, selector valves. Any malfunction could mean rapid fuel loss, or worse, fuel starvation to one of them, the engines. Nothing seemed wrong. Everything seemed like it was going to be routine. The weather was decent. The visibility was acceptable. The formation was tight. Everything seemed like it was going to work. Then, at 6:15 hours, about 2 hours into the flight, Murphy noticed something. The fuel transfer gauge was acting erratic. It should have been transferring fuel from the wing tanks to the main fuselage tanks at a steady rate. Instead, it was fluctuating, gauge readings spiking and dropping. "Skipper, we've got a fuel transfer problem," Murphy said over the intercom. Garrison immediately felt the concern settle into his stomach. A fuel transfer problem meant they might not be able to move all their fuel to where the engines could use it. It meant fuel might become stranded in unreachable tanks. It meant running out of usable fuel even if the aircraft carried enough total fuel. Patterson was already checking the system. "Transfer pump might be cavitating. Let me check the pressures." For the next 20 minutes, Patterson worked the problem, adjusting fuel selector valves, checking pressures, trying different transfer configurations. Eventually, the gauge stabilized. The fuel transfer system seemed to be working again, but it had created doubt. It had created uncertainty. And uncertainty, over 1,000 miles of open ocean, was the enemy. At 13:45 hours, Truck Lagoon was visible below. The formation started its bomb run. Garrison could see the Japanese base spread out below them. Ships in the harbor. Anti-aircraft batteries positioned around the lagoon. Searchlights, even though it was daylight. The Japanese were ready. The anti-aircraft fire started immediately, flak exploding around the formation, leaving black puffs of smoke that the bombers flew through, hoping not to be hit. Garrison heard the metallic sounds of shrapnel hitting the fuselage, a line of impacts stitched across the port wing. One of the hits found something important. The port outer engine suddenly coughed, then died. "Port outer engine is gone," Patterson reported, his voice tight. "Oil pressure 0. She's seized." Garrison immediately started shutdown procedures. With the engine dead, he had to maintain altitude and speed on 3 engines. He had to stay in formation. He had to complete the bomb run. Murphy was staring at the fuel gauges. Bomb bay doors opening? The bombs were already falling. Garrison felt the aircraft suddenly light, suddenly responsive without the weight of ordnance. Around them, the other Liberators were dropping their loads too. Explosions bloomed on the ground below as American ordnance found Japanese targets. And then it was done. The target was behind them. Garrison banked the aircraft hard, breaking away from the formation, heading toward home on 3 engines with fuel reserves that had just become even more critical. Flying a 4-engine bomber on 3 engines was survivable. Flying a 4-engine bomber on 3 engines over 1,000 miles of open ocean was a calculation with very narrow margins. Garrison made the decision immediately. They would not try to catch up with the formation. Staying with the other bombers would require more power, which would burn more fuel. Instead, They would fly their own course home at a fuel-efficient speed, even if it meant arriving late. Patterson was already restructuring the fuel management. With one engine dead, the fuel consumption had decreased, but it had also decreased their speed, which meant the flight home would take longer. Longer flight meant more fuel burned. The math was cruel and circular. "Fuel status?" Garrison asked. Patterson checked the gauges. "Outbound fuel usage has been nominal, but that transfer problem earlier, we might have lost some fuel. I'm estimating we have maybe 900 gallons usable, maybe slightly less." Garrison did the math in his head. They were roughly 950 miles from Nome 4 Island. A B-24 on 3 engines, flying at best fuel efficiency, would consume approximately 110 to 120 gallons per hour. At 950 miles and a cruising speed of 160 miles per hour, they needed roughly 5.75 hours to get home. At 115 gallons per hour, 5.75 hours meant 661 gallons of fuel. They had 900 gallons. The safety margin was 239 gallons. At cruise power, 239 gallons gave them about 2 hours of emergency reserve. That was enough. Barely. But that assumed everything else went right. No additional engine problems. No major headwind. No navigation errors that required extra flying. Garrison settled into the cruise altitude of 12,000 feet. Lower than they'd started, which meant denser air, which meant the engines would work easier, which meant slightly better fuel economy. Murphy was flying now, following the heading Chen had given them. The ocean below was endless. Blue horizon in every direction. No land, no other aircraft. Just the sound of 3 engines and the hum of the fuselage. For the first 3 hours of the return flight, nothing happened. The engines ran smoothly. The fuel consumption seemed to be tracking with Patterson's calculations. The weather was decent. Navigation seemed accurate. Then, at 16:45 hours, Murphy reported something odd. "The wing is showing damage," he said. "Port wing. Looks like shrapnel hit." Garrison couldn't see it from the pilot's seat. He had Murphy describe it in detail. A hole in the leading edge of the port wing, maybe 6 inches across. Not catastrophic, but enough to potentially cause aerodynamic problems. More importantly, the wing had fuel tanks. If the shrapnel had also hit the fuel tank structure, they could be losing fuel through the hole. "Keep monitoring it," Garrison said. "If we start seeing fuel trail or if the gauges drop faster than predicted, let me know immediately." For the next hour, Garrison flew the aircraft with one eye on the altitude, one eye on the airspeed, and half a mind wondering if fuel was leaking from a hole in the port wing. If it was, how much? How fast? When would it become critical? At 17:55 hours, Murphy reported that the fuel gauges were dropping faster than Patterson had predicted. Patterson made a quick calculation. They were losing approximately 15 to 20 gallons per hour through the damaged tank. At that rate, they'd lose approximately 100 gallons before they reached friendly territory. Their safety margin had just disappeared. "Estimated time to Nome 4? Garrison asked Chen. 2 hours and 40 minutes, Chen replied. Give or take, depending on final winds. Garrison did the new math. At their current fuel burn rate plus the leak, they'd consume approximately 320 gallons over the next 2 hours, 40 minutes. They had approximately 700 gallons remaining. They'd have less than 100 gallons left when they landed. Maybe less than 50. A B-24 needed fuel for landing. Fuel to go around if something went wrong. Fuel to climb if they needed altitude. Landing with less than 50 gallons of fuel meant no safety margin. It meant one mistake, and they'd run out of fuel over the ocean. At 1830 hours, with less than 2 hours left in the flight, one of the remaining 3 engines started to run rough. Patterson felt it in the throttle. A slight vibration, a slight hesitation. Then it smoothed out. Then it did it again. "Starboard inner engine is running rough," Patterson reported. "Could be fouled spark plugs. Could be something worse." Garrison felt the fear settle in his chest. They couldn't afford another engine failure. They were already running on minimum fuel. Losing another engine would mean they couldn't maintain altitude. Without altitude, they couldn't make it home. Patterson worked the problem. He adjusted the mixture to the starboard inner engine, switching the fuel selector, checking the magnetos. The engine smoothed out, temporarily, then started running rough again. "I think we've got a cracked cylinder," Patterson said finally. "The engine is still producing power, but not all cylinders are firing properly. I can nurse it, but we can't push it hard." Which meant they couldn't maintain their current speed, which meant the flight would take longer, which meant they'd burn more fuel. "How much longer?" Garrison asked. "Maybe 15-20 minutes. Depends on how badly the cylinder is cracked." 20 minutes extra flight time at 110 gallons per hour meant an additional 35 to 40 gallons of fuel consumed. They didn't have 35 to 40 gallons to spare. Garrison made the decision. They were going to need to find an alternate landing site. WWII Island was going to be too far. They needed something closer. Chen was already working the maps. There's a small airstrip on WWII Island, about 150 miles closer than WWII. Shouldn't be occupied by the Japanese. WWII. Garrison knew the name. It was a small island used by the Australians and Americans as an advance airbase. Runway was shorter than WWII, but it was closer. It was survivable if they could make it. "Divert to WWII," Garrison ordered. Chen updated the heading. The B-24 turned slightly north, tracking toward an airstrip that might or might not have enough fuel to reach. At 1945 hours, Garrison saw the island. WWII. A small patch of green in the middle of endless blue ocean. The airstrip was visible as a thin line of prepared ground. But there was a problem. The fuel gauges were now showing approximately 45 gallons remaining. Maybe 50. Enough to land. Barely enough for one approach. Not enough for a go-around. Not enough for a missed approach and a second try. It had to be perfect the first time. Patterson was managing fuel consumption as carefully as possible. The starboard inner engine was still rough, but still running. The port outer was dead. The other 2 engines were working at minimum power. Murphy was flying now. Garrison watched the airstrip grow larger below them. The runway looked short. Too short. But it was the only option. "Call down for a landing clearance," Garrison told the wireless operator. The radio crackled. Static. Then a voice. Australian accent. "WWII Tower. Liberator inbound. Requesting immediate landing. Declaring emergency. Critically low fuel. Liberator. WWII Tower. Runway is clear. You're clear to land immediately. Emergency equipment standing by." Murphy began the descent. The B-24 dropped toward the runway, engines at minimum power. The damaged port wing was still leaking fuel. The starboard inner engine was still coughing occasionally. Everything on this aircraft was running on fumes and determination. At 500 feet, the airstrip was directly below. Murphy could see the runway markings. He could see the taxiway. He could see a fire truck parked at the edge of the runway, emergency crew standing by. At 300 feet, Murphy cut the engines to idle. The B-24 was descending now, too heavy, too tired, gliding toward the runway like it was too exhausted to actually fly anymore. At 50 feet, the landing gear touched the runway. The B-24 came down hard. Tires squealed. The fuselage bounced slightly on the rough coral runway. Murphy applied brakes. The engines were shut down. The aircraft rolled forward, slowing, stopping. They were down. They were alive. When they rolled to a stop and the engines finally quit, the fuel gauge read 7 gallons. 7 gallons! They would have run out of fuel in approximately 3 minutes of additional flight. The crew didn't move for 30 seconds after the engines shut down. They just sat in the cockpit and in their positions throughout the aircraft, listening to the silence, listening to nothing, just the sound of their own breathing. Then Murphy started laughing, not from humor, from relief, from the release of 18 hours of tension and fear. One by one, the crew unbuckled and started moving. Garrison was the last one out. He walked around the aircraft and looked at the damage. The port wing, holed and still leaking fuel, but slowly now as the remaining fuel settled. The starboard inner engine, visibly damaged, oil stains on the cowling. The fuselage pockmarked with shrapnel holes. This aircraft shouldn't have made it back. All the calculations said it shouldn't have made it back. The engine failure, the fuel leak, the rough cylinder, any one of those alone might have been survivable. Together, they created a situation where the margin between life and death was measured in gallons and minutes. But they'd made it. All 10 crew members, every single one walking away from the aircraft. Some slightly burned, some shaken, but alive. An Australian warrant officer approached Garrison. "That was cutting it bloody close, mate. You were on fumes. Another few minutes and you'd have been in the ocean." Garrison didn't answer. He was still looking at the B-24, still processing the fact that they were alive, still understanding how close they'd come to ditching in the Pacific with a severely damaged aircraft. The Gray Ghost was repaired at WWII. The port outer engine was replaced. The damaged wing was patched. The cracked cylinder in the starboard inner engine was identified, and the entire engine was swapped out. Within 10 days, the aircraft was back in service. But Frank Garrison and his crew didn't fly it. After the truck mission, Garrison was grounded. He'd completed 44 operations. The Army Air Force had a rule. Bomber pilots who completed 50 operations could rotate home. Garrison was 4 operations away, but command made the decision that Garrison had been pushed enough. The truck mission had been a near-death experience. They reassigned him to training duty, training new pilots, training new crews. Garrison spent the last year of the war in training commands, never flying another combat mission. Per Army Air Force personnel records, Major Frank Garrison completed his tour with 44 combat operations in heavy bombers. He was one of the few pilots to survive that many missions. The total average completion rate for bomber pilots was less than 50%. Garrison beat those odds. After the war, Garrison returned to Denver. He went back to engineering. He worked for Lockheed for 15 years, designing aircraft systems. He never talked publicly about his experience. He never wrote a memoir. When asked about the war, he would say simply, "We did our job." Jim Murphy, his co-pilot, also survived the war. After the truck mission, Murphy was promoted and assigned to training duties as well. He ended the war with 42 combat operations. After the war, he became an airline pilot, flying commercial routes for 30 years. He died in 1998. Bob Patterson, the engineer, survived the war and stayed in the Air Force after the war ended. He eventually became a master sergeant in the Air Force Reserve and worked on aircraft maintenance for decades. He lived until 2001. William Chen, the navigator, faced a different fate. After the war ended, he returned to California. But in 1950, Chen was accused of communist sympathies during the McCarthy era and was investigated by the FBI. Although he was eventually cleared, the experience left him traumatized. He passed away in 1975. The rest of the crew scattered across America. Some stayed in the military. Some returned to civilian life. None of them were celebrated. None of them received major recognition for the truck mission or for their survival of the impossible flight home. The Gray Ghost flew another 78 combat missions after the crew's emergency landing at Biak. It was shot down on March 3, 1945, over the island of Mindanao in the Philippines. All 10 crew members died. A different crew, different men, but the same aircraft that had somehow defied all odds to carry Frank Garrison and his crew home. The B-24 Liberator, as a class, flew over 18,000 examples during the war. Over 3,600 were lost in combat. But the aircraft became the backbone of American bombing operations. In the Pacific, Liberators flew longer, farther, and carried heavier loads than any other American heavy bomber. They were the workhorses of the air war, and they're almost completely forgotten. When people remember World War II aviation, they think of the P-51 Mustang, the fighter, the glamorous aircraft. They think of the B-17 Flying Fortress, the durable, iconic bomber. They think of the Enola Gay, the B-29 that dropped the atomic bomb. But they don't think of the B-24. They don't think of the 18,000 aircraft and the tens of thousands of crew members who flew them across the Pacific and across Europe. Frank Garrison flew 44 missions in a B-24. He survived an engine failure, a fuel leak, and a damaged cylinder to bring his crew home with 7 gallons of fuel remaining. He beat odds that killed thousands of other bomber pilots, and almost nobody knows his name. The B-24 Liberator wasn't the most famous heavy bomber of World War II. It wasn't the most glamorous. It wasn't the one that made it into the movies and the history books. But it was the most produced, the most flown, and the one that carried the heaviest burden in the longest campaigns. Frank Garrison flew 44 missions in a B-24 over the Pacific. He faced fighters, flak, mechanical failure, and the constant threat of running out of fuel over 1,000 miles of open ocean. He made decisions that saved his crew's lives, and when his war ended, he went back to Denver and lived a quiet, ordinary life. That's the real story of World War II that doesn't make it into the Hollywood films. It's not about individual heroism. It's not about spectacular victories. It's about ordinary men making extraordinary choices, flying impossible missions, and then coming home to live ordinary lives because that's what life demanded. Frank Garrison is gone now. He died in 2003 at the age of 87. Most people who knew him didn't know about Truck Lagoon. They didn't know about the 7 gallons of fuel. They just knew him as an engineer, a father, a quiet man who'd lived through something most people couldn't even imagine. If this story moved you, if it made you understand how many B-24 stories we've forgotten, hit like and subscribe. Because there are thousands more, thousands of long-range missions, thousands of crews, thousands of survival stories that never made it into the history books. In the comments, tell me, if you were flying that B-24, would you have made the same decisions? Would you have diverted to Biak? Or would you have tried to push for Noam 4? Next video, We're diving into declassified records of a B-17 crew that survived 25 consecutive days adrift in the Pacific Ocean. That story will challenge everything you think about survival. Thanks for watching. Remember the ones we've forgotten, and keep learning about the real heroes, the ones who never got the glory.